Peace. What up? All right, so we're going to continue today. This is chapter 3, Powernomics, part 2, Organizing for Empowerment. Chapter 3, Building Competitive Communities. This nation will be colorblind when whites proclaim their black blood like they proclaim Indian and European lineage. A group's ability to compete is determined by its internal cohesiveness and self-interest. Black Americans must therefore build functional communities within which they can ethno-aggregate, then practice group economics and group politics. A functional community can be best defined as a grouping of people who come together and organize for their own self-interest rather than misdirected altruistic interests. Once built, whether based upon geographical boundaries, ethnic or racial commonalities, a community cares for the collective interests of its members. Building our own communities will allow Black Americans to become economically and politically competitive, but will also give us something we have never had, a chance to compete from the vantage point of our own physical space, cultural values, resources, institutions, and history. For the first time, we will be free to organize and work in our own best interests rather than the interests of a universe of ethnic and class competitors. Historically, societies were built upon three institutions that served as pillars: the family, the church, and the community. True communities are communities of mind and physical structures within a space. Both are important, but no traditional society built on land that it did not own or control has been successful or prospered. Neither the landless European serfs nor the landless Jews under the pharaohs of Egypt were able to do it. For this reason, Black Americans need a solid foundation of communities upon which to begin empowering ourselves. Like Moses, we begin to build physical communities and maintain a strong sense of community. Moses used his vision of the promised land to mobilize his people for a 40-year journey to a land upon which Jews built functional communities, families, religious institutions, commerce, schools, and a strong sense of community. Boundary lines, the new color line. Nearly a century ago, W.E.B. Du Bois accurately proclaimed that the color line would be the problem of the 20th century. It's a new millennium now, and it is becoming clear that the problem of the 21st century will be community boundary lines. America is balkanizing along racial, ethnic, economic, and religious lines. Across America, groups are aggressively seeking territory or communities in which they can store their wealth, resources, and political power to enjoy and preserve for their future generations. As noted earlier, Hispanics, for example, are assembling their economic and political intentions behind their Spanish language and culture. They intend to use both to capture territory, rights, and a political base within the United States. The practice of seeking territory for communities will intensify as more and more people from around the world immigrate to America. They come to America in search of a better quality of life, not to integrate with whites or to get along with Black Americans. They are coming to this country to get ahead economically and to find wealth and fortune. They commit themselves to competing with any and all groups economically and politically on behalf of themselves, their families, and their native countries. Typically, their initial destination is close to or within Black neighborhoods. They have learned from official and unofficial sources that they can find great opportunities in Black neighborhoods. Within Black neighborhoods, ethnic immigrants expect to find the least expensive housing, lax enforcement of laws, and regulation and little business competition. They also find readily accessible consumers, government assistance, easy access to elected officials, and employment opportunities. Though they are aware of the crime problem in Black neighborhoods, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. They find territory and build communities. As ethnics fill in business voids in Black neighborhoods with a modicum of success, they begin to practice ethno-aggregation. They bring in and aggregate their families and others from their native lands. They then develop more businesses in Black neighborhoods. As they capture territory, they establish powerful economies and political organizations using their ethnic culture, language, and religion as their common ground. Watching how these new arriving immigrants use a sense of community to build social and economic power bases should be instructional for Black Americans. It takes a fully functional community to raise a child and to raise up a competitive race of people. Neighborhoods are not enough. Neighborhoods are problematic for any group seeking empowerment. Unfortunately, most Black Americans live in neighborhoods, not communities. A community signifies commitment and a potential for power. Neighborhood does not. Webster's New World Dictionary defines a neighborhood as a vicinity or physical place where there are people living near one another. The concept of a neighborhood implies an area that is residential in nature, with lesser wealth, power, and status than a community. The majority of Black Americans live in impoverished Black neighborhoods and spend approximately 95% of their annual disposable income with the people who live outside of the neighborhood. They spend only 5% of their disposable income in Black neighborhoods. They spend 3% with non-Black owned businesses that are located in Black neighborhoods, but whose owners live outside of Black neighborhoods. Thus, only 2% of Black America's disposable income is spent in Black owned businesses in Black neighborhoods. It is impossible for any large population or neighborhood to be self-sufficient on only 2% of its income. By spending its disposable income in other groups, businesses, and communities, Black America impoverishes itself and impedes the growth of functional communities. One benefit of Jim Crow segregation was that it forced Blacks to build what could appropriately be called quasi-communities. Unlike neighborhoods where people simply live in the same area, during Jim Crow segregation, Black Americans were unified with the code of conduct. They lived together because they had the same interests and needs, but equally as important, they trusted and depended on each other. From the Civil War until the end of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, Blacks successfully built a vibrant culture, marginally competitive schools, Black churches, personal service businesses, and professional class. Though they were small in number, these community assets produced jobs as well as products and services for Black people. The desire for integration caused Blacks to abandon their businesses, communities, culture, and the code of conduct. Black Americans' need to be accepted by white society was greater than their need to be accepted by Black society. Today's Black neighborhoods are no longer qualified to even be called quasi-communities because they no longer have a network of Black businesses or a group code of conduct. Today, Black neighborhoods are primarily where the majority of Black people eat and sleep. They do not embody the criteria for a functional community. Consequently, Black neighborhoods are typically referred to as ghettos, urban areas, inner cities, or they are sometimes identified by terms such as the hood. These broad, ambiguous terms signal the dependent, non-competitive nature of Black geographical areas across the country. Developing a true sense of community. What is a sense of community and why is it important? A sense of community is the collective thinking, seeing, and behaving as we, not as me. Social integration has intensified our need for a strong sense of community or a sense of peoplehood. Having abandoned their quasi-communities, culture, schools, and businesses for the integration promised land, many Black Americans cannot easily return to physical communities that are primarily Black. Those who cannot return can exercise an option. They can identify with Black physical communities and organizations via their mindset, actions, and support. This strong identification and support is what is commonly referred to as a sense of community or sense of peoplehood. It is what people feel when they have a strong psychological identification with the physical community and its inhabitants. They are attracted to and desire the cultural familiarity, security, and satisfaction they receive from association with these communities. The psychological damage Blacks have experienced as a result of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and racism will pose significant challenges to developing a strong sense of community. The impact of social engineering on communities. Throughout the relationship between Blacks and whites, the majority white society has kept Black Americans under various forms of control, physical, legal, and symbolic. The majority society, through its primary institutions, has used rudimentary sociological and psychological principles to control Blacks and deprive them of their sense of peoplehood. In such a state, Black people could easily be misled into inappropriate behavior, identifying with the oppressor groups and hating their own group. This is not a conspiracy theory. The facts are evident in the marked inequalities between the races and continued inappropriate behavior patterns of Black Americans. There is no other way to explain why historical inequalities remain unchanged and Black Americans continue to cede and surrender their wealth and resource powers to their competitors while their own family, community, and the race as a whole remain powerless and impoverished. These are neither innate nor normal behavior characteristics, so let us examine their origins. Research suggests that aberrant group behaviors among Blacks began in 1710 and were formalized into law when the Virginia colonial government introduced meritorious manumission, a public policy that was used to condition and instill internal controls into the psyche of enslaved Blacks. The practice rewarded Blacks who saw slavery through the eyes of the white society, were willing to work against their own group's best interests and informal members of their race who were planning to escape and free other Blacks. This social engineering effectively destroyed most Black people's sense of community, trust, and accountability. Though undocumented, many Black Americans believe that soon after its inception, meritorious manumission was merged into what we now call Willie Lynchism. According to popular belief, Willie Lynch came to Jamestown, Virginia in 1712, offering a mind-controlling ideology to destroy Black people's sense of community. A professional slave trainer, Willie Lynch, offered the slaveholders a conditioning system that he guaranteed would instill internal controls that would effectively divide Blacks for centuries. He proposed that slave masters create divisions among Blacks and separate them along the lines of gender, age, tribe, culture, class, rank, and skin color. To this day, the effects of Willie Lynchism continue to encourage Black individualism, selfishness, and self-hatred. I'm going to just pause momentarily because I don't know if y'all be noticing. I be seeing people talk light skin, dark skin, and not even realizing like we all the same. There's different variations and tonalities, skin color, or what have you. But at the end of the day, man, we really all we got. And if we don't do something and put our heads together, man, this is gonna be history. My pops used to say, like in 50, 100 years or so, they're gonna have like a science museum, and they're gonna have like a young Black man in wax with his pants hanging down saying that this was the urban homeboy, but he couldn't learn how to adapt, so now he's extinct. And it's deep. He the first person I heard say that. You know what I mean? Now, I don't want that to be the future, and we don't have to allow it to be the future. But we got to stop saying stuff amongst ourselves like light skin, dark skin. You know what I mean? It's just little simple stuff, man, if we got back to it. I think what he's saying is true. You know what I mean? Those Uncle Toms or those individuals back in the 1700s, 1800s, even to this day, you know what I mean, that, tell on us, or I guess point out that focus on the bad in us and don't really just focus on the bad everywhere. You know what I mean? We as a people just really need to come together better. You know what I mean? I appreciate this book because he's saying a lot of things that I would like to say, but he's actually giving suggestions for solutions as opposed to just stating a problem. All right, so where was I? Though slavery and Jim Crow slavery officially ended in 1865 and 1954 respectively, no formal records are known to have been kept that explain the principles and techniques involved in the conditioning process. If our goal is to build functional communities, we can, however, understand the techniques and methods that were used to destroy our sense of community. We can more fully understand what happened if we analyze a similar and better documented mind control experiment that occurred during the Korean War of the 1950s. Meritorious manumission versus brainwashing. Both American soldiers held in North Korean prisoner of war camps during the 1950s and enslaved Black people were psychosocially and physiologically manipulated in parallel ways. The communist North Korean army and its Chinese consorts used brainwashing on American soldiers. Slavery used conditioning. The biggest difference between the two systems was the extreme physical cruelty of slavery. Both systems were designed to tear people apart. In many ways, communist brainwashing was a combination of meritorious manumission and Willie Lynchism. It was a sophisticated form of re-education that operated like group therapy run in reverse. But unlike group therapy intended to bring people together, communist brainwashing and meritorious manumission were designed to drive people apart from one another. The larger purpose of these social conditioning systems was to destroy the ability of the subjects to form natural groups and communities, develop normal relationships, support, protect, and communicate with members of their own group. Table 2 offers a brief comparative analysis of the brainwashing of military captives in North Korea and China over a 3-year period and the meritorious manumission policies or Willie Lynchism imposed on Blacks for several centuries. The table compares the similarities between the goals, psychological principles, rewards, punishments, and resultant behavior changes. These results of the two systems were nearly identical in every respect, but in each instance, the subjects identified with their oppressors and were often unwilling to return to their former communities to be with their own people. The brainwashed POWs who survived were hospitalized and deprogrammed. No such therapy has ever been offered to Black Americans. I'm going to just read a few of these, not everything. This is a table that is a comparison of the conditioning control techniques. It's like meritorious manumission, Willie Lynchism on one side, and on the opposite side, there's communist power brainwashing. Subjects. Nearly 15 million African slaves on plantations throughout the Americas. On the power brainwashing side, or the communist power brainwashing side, nearly 7,000 white American soldiers in power camps in North Korea. Big difference in numbers, but they're just trying to say the similarities as far as what they were. All right, their goal as far as Willie Lynchism and meritorious manumission was to control a large group of captured slaves and make them hardworking, fearful, dependent, docile, submissive, and loyal labor tools to build wealth for their captors. As far as the communist prisoners of war brainwashing, their goal was to control a large group of captured POWs using minimum resources, make them non-combative, dependent, and compliant to be used as propaganda tools. I'm going to just go to the success rate, which is at the bottom. After 360 years, 36 million descendants of slaves have the shortest life expectancy, low self-esteem, remain divided and non-competitive. They remain fearful and continue to seek white approval and rewards that come with being sambos and sellouts. The prisoners of war success rate, only 2,000 of the original 7,000 American prisoners of war survived. Most prisoners of war camps had no guards or fences, yet not one American prisoner of war escaped in an organized attempt. Survivors remained withdrawn. Prisoners of war became turncoats against their own country. Okay. Brainwashed for life. Simply put, brainwashing was an intensive program of dehumanization, physical degradation, re-education, and indoctrination. The North Korean communists, much like Willie Lynch, were not simply interested in controlling the prisoners of war while they were in prison camps. They wanted to create humans who would permanently see the world through the eyes of a captor even after they were free and integrated back into everyday American society. Both systems were enormously successful. Like black slaves, the imprisoned soldiers were captured, transported into a hostile country, made a minority in their segregated prison communities, and made totally dependent upon their captors for the basic necessities of life. Dependence eventually bloomed into indebtedness. The prisoners of war were grateful to their captors for a few kindnesses, such as occasional extra food, an apple, a piece of candy, or an extra blanket. These extras from the oppressors were a little different from the welfare, food stamps, and public housing subsidies that present-day blacks receive. And, like the white overclass of today, the Korean Guards reduced or totally eliminated the benefit when displeased with a prisoner of war behavior. The power exercised by the Guards and the powerlessness of the prisoners of war themselves constantly reinforced the cycle of despair and suffering. Korean brainwashing broke the will of highly trained soldiers so that they had no interest in trying to escape. It destroyed the prisoners of war trust, code of conduct, and sense of connection to their captured comrades. Many chose to become turncoats and remain with their captors after release. Meritorious manumission and Willie Lynchism had nearly the identical effect on black slaves and their descendants. They conditioned and broke their will. Only a few thousand of more than 5 million slaves ever attempted an escape. Out of 252 known slave revolts, a black one formed nearly every time. Ironically, on the eve of the Civil War, over 6,000 blacks were slaveholders. Many fought with the Confederacy to maintain slavery. Some even elected to stay with the white slave masters after the war was over. The analysis of brainwashing provides insight into why blacks avoid blackness and lack accountability to members of our team. Social integration is disintegration. Throughout the centuries, social engineering, especially integration, has led blacks to destroy their own group solidarity. Social integration reinforced the practice and destroyed black communities and sense of community. Increasingly, blacks are viewing social integration in America as a failure. It is a form of tokenism. It has given black Americans limited access to resources and institutions within mainstream society. It gave with one hand and took back with the other hand. Blacks now own and control less than they did in 1954 before the integration process began. Blacks gave up their own businesses, educational institutions, political leadership, culture, and quasi-communities. By comparison, approximately 90% of all the Asians, Arabs, and Hispanics in America immigrated within the last 30 years following the end of the Black Civil Rights Movement and have economically surpassed blacks. Each group owns and controls more income, wealth, and businesses than 99% of Black Americans who have been in America for centuries. The civil rights movement and social integration opened the nation's doors of wealth and power to everyone except black people. Once the majority society consented to integrate blacks, whites began a scorched earth policy, intentionally destroying large urban cities, abandoning them, and cannibalizing their industries, businesses, and other wealth-producing entities. As I'm reading this, I'm just thinking about the stuff that is happening like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Los Angeles, Winston-Salem, everywhere, you know what I mean, where we were thriving at some point where we had been destroyed by white mobs and the police, or possibly even white nationalists such as the Ku Klux Klan, or people that just really did not like us. It just got me thinking, like, you know what I mean, this is deep. Whites frequently complain that blacks are, wait, hold on, I'm sorry. Yep, no, I'm right. The majority society has forced blacks to bear the burdens associated with the integration process. Whites frequently complain that blacks are too race conscious. In fact, their inappropriate behavior patterns indicate that they have not been race conscious. When integration destroyed black business communities, black consumers commuted to white suburban malls and started spending approximately 95% of their annual disposable income outside of their own communities. Black colleges were converted into miniature white colleges. Blacks seeking education, jobs, homes, and leadership were forced to turn to the majority white society. Integration has a built-in unofficial quota system of 5 to 8%, sometimes called the tipping point, to ensure that blacks will always be powerless, non-controlling minority, to ensure that blacks will always be a powerless, non-controlling minority in white communities, businesses, schools, and public offices. Once the black percent reaches 5 to 8%, whites become fearful of losing their majority status and control over blacks. They sell their homes, move their businesses, and transfer their children to all-white schools. Typically, a situation where whites are the majority and blacks are the minority is described as racial balance. Social integration co-opted blacks into practicing individualism rather than group solidarity and group competitiveness. Individualism is the perfect ideological weapon to defend the group privilege that each generation of whites inherits over blacks. Individualism gives what appears to be a reasonable explanation for black underachievement. Further, it provides a responsive and neutral justification for opposing any compensatory or preferential treatment for blacks while protecting the political and economic group interests of whites. By ignoring racism, individualism maintains the racial status quo. It argues that emancipation, integration, affirmative action, or even separation for blacks are wrong because government will be called upon to support the rights of the group over the revered rights of individuals. Table 3 shows the placement of blacks in terms of group competitiveness and consciousness. While white Europeans, Americans, and blacks are individualistic, Asians, Middle Easterners, and wait. Let me read this again. While white Europeans, Americans, and blacks are individualistic, Asians, Middle Easterners, and Latins practice groupism, stressing solidarity, working together for the common good of the family and community. Table 3 shows that if any group is out of place, it is Black America at the bottom of column 1. Due to social conditioning, Black Americans view the concept of individualism through the eyes of European white society. This puts most blacks at odds with their own group's interests. All the population groups in column 1 are considered white. Except Black Americans. Black America mistakenly placed a higher value on individual achievement and merit as opposed to group achievement. We surrender our competitive advantages to group-oriented immigrants who enter and dominate Black business areas and outcompete blacks for jobs and education and social opportunities. Black America will continue to suffer a double loss, losing out to groups identified in both column 1 and column 2, as long as there is a gap between our ideology and the reality of our predicament. Our value is misplaced. We should not be the individualistic column. We will remain outside and underneath the European white societies until we develop a coherent group orientation and identity. When blacks act as individuals rather than as a group, it is easy for the majority society to control and manipulate them. It also brings comfort to whites because it lowers their fear of blacks as a group competitor. Blacks are further misled by our celebrity culture. In our celebrity culture, the status assigned to popular blacks gives the illusion that blacks are judged and accepted based upon individual achievement rather than the acceptability of the group and community to which they cosmetically belong. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pick it up later on. Appreciate you viewing. Peace. Have a great day. Peace.